currently postdocing at Princeton.
Yes.
Got her PhD from Penn State, and her PhD work was on manganese oxide. Manganese is the new black, tailoring black manganese oxide precipitation for the remediation of acid mine drainage.
Thank you all for coming. I know you're here for the pizza, but I like to think that you were also curious as to why manganese is the new black. And my research focuses on using manganese oxides in acid mine drainage remediation. Acid mine drainage, this is a picture of what some of this water looks like. You've got this really reddish colored stream water coming out. And this is very acidic stream water. And it's red because there's high iron in these along with other contaminant metals. And acid mine drainage is bad for, it can destroy fish and it can destroy wildlife. The reason it's there is because there are some old abandoned mines, especially around Pennsylvania. A lot of my sites are around this area. And you have these rocks that are exposed during mining, and these rocks can include pyrite or fool's gold if you learned about it in mineralogy. The chemical formula for pyrite is iron sulfide, and when iron sulfide is exposed to oxygen and water, it can react to form iron hydroxides along with sulfates and hydrogen ions. And the hydrogen ions are what causes the water to be acidic. Of course, when you have very acidic water, you also can start dissolving other minerals in the rock formation. And so this leads to more contamination in the stream water of other different metals. So what do we need to remediate for or treat for when we're looking at acid mine drainage? As I mentioned before, you have high acidity. There's also sulfate release, and there's dissolved iron in the water. You also get other dissolved metals such as dissolved manganese, copper, aluminum, lead, zinc, nickel. And a lot of us know that lead is not good for you. High levels of zinc and nickel are also bad for your body, and so these are things that we need to treat for when we think about acid mine drainage remediation. So the two questions that I want us to think about today is, how do we treat for acid mine drainage? And why is manganese the new black? Some methods that we use to treat for acid mine drainage include active treatment. So in active treatment systems, you're basically actively adding something into the water, such as lime, in order to treat for the acidity or the sulfate in the water. And the problem with active treatments is that you're using a lot of chemicals that you have to put in, and you have to continuously add this to the acid mine drainage until it is the appropriate levels for the natural stream water. The other way that is a little bit more affordable is a passive treatment system. And this is an overhead view of what a passive treatment system looks like. And basically you're building a series of man-made ponds that you can aim the stream water to flow through, and as it flows through these ponds, you treat for different aspects of the chemistry in your acid mine drainage water. And so here in this picture you can see you start with some very red water, and it changes color as it passes through these systems. We're going to talk a lot about passive treatment systems today because those are the types of sites that I look at in my field work. And in a passive treatment system, you have a series of ponds. One type of pond is called a vertical flow pond. In a vertical flow pond, you can have a pond and you have your inflow water coming in and then your outflow water coming out. At the bottom of this, you have a limestone layer, and above that is a compost layer. The compost layer allows for bacteria to reduce the sulfate in the water. And so at the same time, when you have lots of compost, you have lots of decomposition, and the bacteria in there can not only reduce the sulfate, there's also a lot of bacteria using up the oxygen. So once the water gets to that limestone layer, then you have an anoxic environment. And the limestone layer is there in order to treat for the acidity of the water. Much like when you take a limestone mineral and you pour a little bit of acid on it into the field, you get a neutralization reaction. So it's neutralizing the acid in the acid mine drainage water. The reason why this layer is, it's important that this layer is oxygen free is because your metals that are also dissolved in the water, once they react with oxygen, it can start forming solids called metal oxides. And so we don't want those to start precipitating out or they'll start clogging up the system. By the way, feel free to ask questions if you have any along the way. Another type of passive treatment system is just a wetland. And basically in a wetland, you have a pond filled with compost. And the purpose of a wetland is to just promote even more bacterial sulfate reduction. And so you have water flowing through that compost layer and taking that sulfate away from the stream water. And then the last pond that I'm going to show you today is called a settling pond, or the last pond for this part of this talk. It's called a settling pond. And this is a pond where you promote oxygen and you want the presence of oxygen. So a lot of times you'll have vegetation, such as cattails, and these will improve the amount of oxygen in the water so that when oxygen is present, dissolved metals such as iron can react with the oxygen and precipitate into an iron oxide and settle out of the solution, kind of like what you see in the solids down here. And what happens with these three type of ponds is that you can link them up into a series. So you can, for example, start with a vertical flow pond, have the water treated for sulfate and acidity, and then treated for more sulfate as it flows through a wetland, and then finally you have your settling pond where you have some of these iron oxides settling out of the water. And so far, if we think about what we were trying to treat, we've treated a little bit for acidity, we've treated for sulfate, and we've treated for dissolved iron by letting it settle out as a metal oxide. Well, what about all these other things we have? We still have dissolved manganese, we still have dissolved copper, aluminum, lead, zinc, nickel, etc. The sites that I look at in particular, they tend to be these acid mine drainage sites that have a lot of manganese in them. And this is one of our sites in Glasgow, Pennsylvania. And these ponds here are all part of this passive treatment system that they've built in this area to remediate the acid mine drainage. This is a map of what that passive treatment system looks like. So first you start with the vertical flow pond. And so you're treating for sulfate and acidity there. And then you move down to a wetland where you treat for sulfate. And then back to another vertical flow pond, and then another wetland. And then these are settling ponds where we're letting iron oxides settle out of the system. And then we go back to a wetland. But so far we've treated a lot of these. Again, we've treated acidity, sulfate, and dissolved iron. The pieces down here are for treating manganese and everything else. And so the big question we have is, how do we remove manganese? Any guesses? Well, we have dissolved iron that comes out as iron oxides. What do you think manganese comes out as?
Manganese oxide.
Yeah, manganese oxide. Good. So manganese oxide. And what is a manganese oxide? The basic building block of a manganese oxide is manganese bonded to 6 oxygen atoms. And so you can link these up to form chains and sheets of manganese octahedra. If you remember in mineralogy, you also have your silicate tetrahedra, which is silica bonded to 4 oxygen atoms. And those can similarly link up to chains and sheets. And this is what the manganese octahedra are doing. And once you link those up into chains and sheets, you can also have those chains and sheets combining into a bunch of different manganese oxide minerals. You can have layer structures, so this is a phylomanganate. Instead of a phyllosilicate, which you have in clays, you have a phylomanganate. But you can also have tunnel structures, like 2x1 tunnel structures, or 2x2 tunnel structures. These blue shapes are the manganese octahedra. And so all of these are found naturally in the environment. There's more than 40 manganese oxide minerals. But how do we form these in the first place? The challenge about forming manganese oxides in our acid mine drainage treatment system is that the presence of iron can prevent the precipitation of manganese oxides. And you also need a relatively high pH for manganese oxide precipitation to occur. And so one nice thing is we've already talked about how we treated for the presence of iron. We treated it by precipitating it out as iron oxides. Well, we still have this pH issue. And in the non-biological formation of manganese oxides, you need a pH from 9 to 11 in order to have the manganese oxide precipitate out. Unfortunately, most of our acid mine drainage systems are treated to about a pH around 6 to 8, which is a little bit more neutral. But the nice thing is there is something where you can have biology relating or participating in the formation of these manganese oxides. And these can occur from pHs 6 to 8, which is right in the range that is perfect for acid mine drainage treatment. And studies show that when you culture certain bacteria or fungi collected from the field, they can produce manganese oxide. So this is a culture where these black, wavy formations, these are manganese oxides precipitated by bacteria. And down here are some fungi that have been cultured, and these are the hyphae of the fungi. And the reason why they're dark brown is because they're coated in this manganese oxide. The way we do this in the field to promote the growth of bacteria and fungi is we have two different things. We have metal removal units and manganese removal beds. And a metal removal unit looks like this. You have this big wooden box, and you fill it with coconut coir. And coconut coir is basically the hairy part of a coconut on the shell. And they use this material because it's cheap, it's affordable, and they just throw it in there. And so you have your acid mine drainage water coming in here, and then coming out on this side. And so this coconut coir, it's usually brown like over here, but when you have manganese oxides precipitating out, they start getting coated in this really dark black color. The other unit we use in this system is a manganese removal bed. So there's your metal removal unit with your coconut coir, and here's your manganese removal bed. And what a manganese removal bed is, it's a lot like your vertical flow pond, where you just have this humongous piece of land with lots of limestone in it. And so all of these are limestone. You can see there's vegetation growing on it, and there's water coming through. And if you dig a hole in these limestone beds, you see that the water is just really, really black, and that's because of the manganese oxide precipitating out. And so here limestone is promoting it's adjusting for the pH, so it's making the system more alkaline and further allowing that other aspect where we need a high pH to promote the precipitation of manganese oxides. And so far we've treated for acidity, we've treated for sulfate, we've treated for dissolved iron, and we've just treated for dissolved manganese. Well, what about all this other stuff? It would be very inefficient for us to go through all of these one at a time and try to build something to treat each dissolved metal individually. So how do we remove all this stuff? And it turns out that the answer lies in the manganese oxides. In a natural manganese oxide, this is a chemical map of a natural manganese oxide, and they found that lead is associated with these manganese oxides on the outer rim of this particle. They also find this for zinc. So here is a manganese oxide coating in red, and zinc is attached to all of the manganese oxide associated with this, which tells us that manganese oxides are great because they can attract a lot of these contaminant metals, and they're also very reactive in that sense. But we have all these different manganese oxide minerals. We have layered structures, we have tunnel structures. Which one is the best for acid mine drainage remediation? And our hypothesis is that this layer structure, which is called bernacite, is the best because layer structures, well, this layer structure is not only the most common, It's also the most chemically active. And that's because when you have these layers, you can interact not only on the surface, but also in the interlayer of your mineral, as opposed to your tunnels where it might be difficult to interact within the tunnel itself. And when we're looking at this layer structure, bernacite, there's two known varieties. There's triclinic bernacite and there's hexagonal bernacite. You may have learned in some kind of crystallography class that the triclinic and the hexagonal denote the different crystal symmetries of your minerals. The main difference that I want to emphasize between these two is that your hexagonal bernacite has these vacancy sites in its octahedral sheet. A vacancy site is basically a hole. So say you have all these sheets, these nice manganese octahedral sheets, these ones have holes in them. And the reason why these are important, it turns out, is that some computer modeling has shown that a lot of different metals, such as lead, nickel, and zinc, not only attach to the surface and edge sites of your manganese octahedra, they can also attach to these holes. And so if you want a lot of metal uptake, then you want a lot of these holes in your mineral. And so that means that we want hexagonal bernacite, which is not only layered, which makes it very chemically reactive, but it also has lots of these holes in its manganese octahedral sheets. But we don't really know what types of manganese oxides are found in our acid mine sites yet, so we initially have to investigate this question. From the laboratory, these fungal and bacterial experiments that I showed you originally, they produced hexagonal bernacite. And so that's promising for the field, because if they're already producing hexagonal bernacite in the lab, maybe they're doing the same in the field. And so my work looked at a lot of these acid mine drainage sites and what types of manganese oxides they were precipitating. I had a set of synthetic, ideal triclinic and hexagonal bernacites that I made in the lab, and these are the ideal minerals. So something to compare to when I'm thinking of what is the perfect triclinic and hexagonal bernacite. And then I also collected a bunch of manganese oxides from acid mine drainage sites. This is a sample from a metal removal unit, and all this stringy stuff is the coconut coir that's in it, and it's black from the manganese oxide coating. And over here is some manganese oxide from a manganese removal bed. And so you see I've dug a hole and the water is black due to the manganese oxide. And so I collected some of the limestone pieces that were coated with the manganese oxide. I did some scanning electron microscopy on these, and you can see that these are images of the manganese oxides. And over here on the left is one of our limestone pieces that have been coated with the manganese oxide. So these beautiful layers are the manganese oxide layers on top of the limestone. Over here on the right is a sample from DeSalle, Pennsylvania, from a stream. And the manganese oxides are these really tiny, less than 10 micron flakes that conglomerate into the fluffy spherules that you see here. You can see more of these fluffy conglomerations in a lot of our other sites. This one isn't as fluffy looking, and you also find some clays in there, some aluminosilicates mixed in with the manganese oxides. And these you even find some diatoms, which is basically microalgae, I guess. And they're these really beautiful structures. And one question that's out there is, are these diatoms, like bacteria and fungi, also participating in the precipitation of these manganese oxides? And we don't really know that yet. As far as chemistry goes, all of these have manganese, they all have oxygen, which is not surprising, these are manganese oxides. They also have calcium, which is because there's a lot of dissolved calcium in the system as a result of the limestone everywhere. But the great thing is we also find a lot of metals associated with these manganese oxides, including aluminum, iron, zinc, lead, magnesium, potassium, nickel, etc. So that's telling us that these manganese oxides are doing their job. But how do we identify these? The main tool used in geology is to identify phases and crystal structures is using X-ray diffraction. In X-ray diffraction, you have your crystal sample here, and you shoot an X-ray beam at it, and the planes in the crystal structure will diffract the incoming X-rays into a diffraction pattern over here. And depending on what kind of crystal structure you have, you will get a diffraction pattern that is a signature of that particular mineral. And so what you can do is you can vary the angle that you're shooting your X-ray tube at, which is called the angle theta. And then as you vary that angle with your crystal structures all mixed up, you can get all of the different diffraction angles and patterns coming out to be detected. This is what an X-ray diffraction pattern looks like. On the bottom you have 2 theta, which is that angle I was just telling you about. And then on the y-axis you have intensity, which is your intensity of the counts of the X-ray minerals after they've been diffracted. This is what the diffraction pattern looks like for a synthetic triclinic bernacite. And this is what it looks like for a synthetic hexagonal bernacite. And these are, again, our very ideal laboratory materials. And the defining peak for bernacite is that there's this peak right here around 5 to 6 2 theta. The differences between the synthetic hexagonal and synthetic triclinic can be seen in this 15 to 22 theta region where you have different numbers and peaks and different peak positions. Above that are 2 natural samples, and they both are bernacite because they have this peak right here. But when we look at this 15 to 22 theta region, we see some really broad peaks, and we can't really tell if they're hexagonal or triclinic. And this is because the manganese oxides that we're finding at our acid mine drainage remediation sites are really poorly crystalline and very small in particle size. And when you think about XRG, what we needed was a nice crystal structure in order to allow the X-rays to diffract. And we don't have that in a poorly crystalline structure. In order to identify our manganese oxides, we decided to turn to Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or FTIR. And you may have used this in your chemistry class, but unfortunately the database for a lot of oxides is lacking in this technique. But we decided to use it anyway. FTIR is useful because it measures the amount of energy absorbed by your chemical bonds. And so you can vary the wavelength of your incoming radiation, and that bond vibration will vary depending on how much energy it's absorbing. And so this, like X-ray diffraction, can give you some kind of a signature on the types of chemical bonds in your sample. And the great thing about this is you don't need a really nice crystalline structure for this. You just need the chemical bonds to be present. But we first needed to figure out whether we can differentiate between triclinic and hexagonal bernacite. These are 2 FTIR patterns. On the x-axis, you have your wave number, or a value for infrared radiation. On the y-axis, you have your absorbance of your IR. And so this is the FTIR pattern for a hexagonal bernacite that was synthetic. And this is for a synthetic triclinic bernacite. Down here, around 3,500 inverse wave numbers, inverse centimeters, these are peaks related to water molecules in your structure. Down here, around 500 inverse centimeters, are peaks that are related to manganese oxygen bond distances. So this is related to that manganese octahedra in our crystal structure. And so if we blow that up, we see that there are differences between triclinic and hexagonal bernacite. Specifically, we see, things didn't show up. But we see these 3 peaks for triclinic bernacite, and we see these 2 peaks for hexagonal bernacite. And that's telling us that FTIR can differentiate between these 2 synthetic ideal samples. Well, what about our natural samples? So here I've zoomed in on the manganese oxygen bond distance region. And at the top, I have a synthetic triclinic bernacite for reference and a synthetic hexagonal bernacite at the bottom for reference. Everything else in between is a natural sample. And so if you look at your peaks for synthetic triclinic bernacite, you can see that some of these samples above have similar 3 peaks. So for example, this Tennessee stream sample, this PBS sample. If you look at the peaks for a synthetic hexagonal bernacite, you can see that some of the samples at the bottom also have these 2 defining peaks, especially this sample from Glasgow, Pennsylvania, which is the site that I was showing you. And so we're finding there's some triclinic and there's some hexagonal across these different acid mine drainage sites. If we look at all of these in the order that I've put them in, you might even see that there's some gradual peak shift from the top to the bottom, and that some of these might even be something in between, or a mixture between triclinic and hexagonal bernicite. So we asked the question, what types of manganese oxides form at these acid mine drainage sites? We're finding that both triclinic and hexagonal bernicites are forming, but we want hexagonal bernicite, right, because it has more holes. So how do we form hexagonal bernicite at these acid mine drainage sites? Before we answer that question, we want to think about what environmental conditions are causing the formation of triclinic versus hexagonal bernicite. Unfortunately, our field data is a little lacking because a couple of other people collected some of our samples. It wasn't our initial goal to look into all of these factors, but we have a hypothesis that the amount of hexagonal bernicite that is present in our acid mine drainage site might be related to alkalinity. Now, these are only 4 data points, and I would not be a good scientist if I said that this is a real trend. But the reason why we say this, I'll go into this a little bit later, but I want to tell you that I want to first think about what alkalinity is. Alkalinity is a measure of the buffering capacity of the water and how well it can maintain a pH. And so if you remember from chemistry class, a buffer is basically a weak acid as opposed to a strong acid. And strong acids like hydrochloric acid or hydrofluoric acid can pretty much dissociate completely the minute you put it in water. The weak acids don't dissociate as quickly, and they can kind of go back and forth between being an associated acid versus a dissociated acid. And so the higher the alkalinity, the higher the ability for the water to buffer the pH. And so I want to make a note that alkalinity is different from the word alkaline. When you have alkaline, you have a pH that's greater than 7. Alkalinity is measuring this buffering capacity. You can think of this as the difference between temperature versus heat capacity. Temperature is a measurement. For example, it can be 25 degrees Celsius in this room. Heat capacity is the amount of heat it takes to change the amount, the amount of heat it takes to change your temperature of a material by 1 degree Celsius. And so that's kind of the difference between alkaline versus alkalinity. And going back to why I think alkalinity might be responsible for the production of hexagonal bernicite, this hypothesis is a result of some laboratory experiments that we've done with some idealized triclinic bernicites. In these laboratory experiments, we basically have beakers where we took some triclinic bernicite and we put it in buffered solutions. So there's a Heaps buffer, there's an MES buffer, and we have a control of unbuffered pH 7 solution. What we did at the end of these experiments, these ran for 14 days, was we took the bernicites and we took an X-ray diffraction pattern of it. And this is, again, what a synthetic triclinic bernicite looks like, our idealized sample. And this is what a hexagonal bernicite looks like. So when we took this triclinic bernicite, when we put it in a Heaps buffered solution, we see that there are some changes in this region, and this material now matches hexagonal bernicite. When we put it in a different buffer, an MES buffer, we also see some changes in this region. But it's not a full hexagonal bernicite. It's actually a mixture between the two. But the point is that we're seeing these transformations from triclinic to hexagonal bernicite in these laboratory buffered experiments. The reason why it turns out that the MES buffer is not as strong in producing hexagonal bernicite is because MES has a weaker buffering capacity at pH 7. So when we're thinking about this, we want to collect more field work at some point and measure alkalinity. And we want to think about, will these buffers promote the transformation of natural to hexagonal bernicite in the field and also in the lab? And are there differences in metal uptake between the natural triclinic and hexagonal bernicite if there really are all these vacancies? And then finally, can we better control the environmental conditions that we're using in order to form more hexagonal bernacite and uptake more contaminant metals at our acid mine drainage remediation sites. And so earlier in the talk, I wanted us to look at two questions. First was, how do we treat for acid mine drainage? And would anyone like to contribute and tell me what you've learned? Nothing. Okay.
Quiz, a pop quiz.
Discussion. You get free pizza if you answered it. Yes.
Either active or passive treatment systems.
Great. So you have your active and your passive treatment systems. And you get this whole box of pizza. So in an active treatment, you can actively add substances like lime. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. In a passive treatment, you have a series of vertical flow ponds and wetlands and some kind of similar combination of these in order to passively treat for the acidity and sulfates and contaminants in your acid mine drainage remediation. So why is manganese the new black? Yes.
Because the oxides produce like a black color.
So it's black, yes. But why is it good for the acid mine drainage remediation site that there are manganese oxides present? Yes.
I mean, it's taking it out of the water and
Precipitating.
precipitating it out to make it lay on the ground, so that way it's not the manganese isn't free flowing, it becomes it deposits kind of.
Right, so it's now a solid. What can that solid do? Yes.
Well, also I was going to say it also helps taking out other harmful metals.
Yes, great.
By filling in the void spaces in the lattice.
Yeah, great. Yeah, perfect. So manganese is the new black because it attracts all the dissolved metals. And so with that, I'd like to take any questions you have. Yes.
So, have you looked at the water before it goes through all this treatment, and then once it comes out, you can tell if these manganese oxides are doing their job. So, see what I'm saying, taking the, not the iron, but, not manganese, but aluminum, copper, not aluminum, copper, zinc, and all those other metals. So do you see a decrease in concentration anyway in these natural
Yes.
situations before you target bernacite or whatever it is? So,
Yeah, so you do see a significant decrease before and after the bernacite. And so the sites that we have, they regularly monitor these to see what they need to adjust for the site. And so they do see decreases over time.
so that's evidence that there is bernacite of this crystallographic.
Evidence for,
The manganese oxide sucking up these other metals.
yes. So it's evidence that manganese oxides are able to take these things up. Yes.
Is the coir anything more than a substrate, or is it actively involved, like in the mode of keeping redox low?
Right.
And are there other materials that, I mean, coir isn't really locally available. Something else we could use that would have
Yeah.
distribution that's a little bit more proximal to the.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that we don't understand the biological processes very well, and whether coir is actively participating in it or not, we don't really know for sure. It's definitely ongoing work. I'm not really sure. So the company who makes the metal removal units, I'm not really sure why they picked coir in the first place, except it was cheap for them. But they've also been trying a couple new things, they've also been trying to put the coir in manganese beds and see how that'll go. But I can't say that coir is the answer to precipitating out manganese oxides.
I know in the case of simply using limestone, you have the challenge that you eventually coat the limestone
Right.
cobbles, and of course then their chemical activity is nil,
Yeah.
because they no longer actually have interaction with the water. And again, one might ask, does this happen? Well, does it happen in the manganese reduction bed? Do you have to replace the coir?
So I know that they do clean it out, just like the manganese removal beds. They clean it out of manganese every couple months.
And then can you recover that manganese oxide and do anything useful with it?
That's an even better question. So right now, well, manganese oxides do have applications in other things. They're used in batteries. They have potential uses in solar cell technology. Right now, all they're doing with the manganese oxide is they're giving it to people who do pottery, and they use the manganese oxide to make the clay that they're using black. So
Now it has lead and zinc and nickel and other nifty things in it that.
yeah, so I guess a lot of other glazes also have some of these metals in it. So they're using it for pottery. They're polishing it off, and then I think they say not to put it in the dishwasher kind of thing to wash it. Yeah,
Decorative pottery.
decorative pottery.
That doesn't put me at ease.
Yes.
I guess this is more like big picture. So ideally, you'd want more of like the HEPS buffer in like some of these reclamation ponds. And the with the hexagonal bernicite, does that have to do with more surface area or just the holes in the lattice?
It's the holes in the lattice.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So, how, like, as of right now, how widespread is this practice? Are people already doing this, or is it?
Around Pennsylvania, it's pretty widespread. I don't know about other states. I don't have that many other sites in other states. Yes.
I want to ask about rates. How long does it have to, move through these systems, and do they vary the flow in order to change the rates, or is this something more or less happens instantaneously?
So they do try to give it a good amount to stay in there and allow, they have to like calculate it and things like that. I'm not familiar with how long it takes. I forget exactly what they said, but I think it usually sits for a couple of days in a certain pond.
Are the triclinic and the hexagonal forms sort of equally stable at the Earth's surface?
You know, that's a very good question. So it turns out that triclinic bernicite below pH 8.2 will start transforming to some extent to hexagonal bernicite. You'll get a full transformation around pH 2 and pH 3, but then that calls into question when we have these acid migraine remediation sites that have been remediated to around pH 7, why do we even have triclinic bernicite? And we don't really know. Yes.
What is heaps buffer?
Heaps
And
buffer.
does it have any question marks attached to it?
So heaps buffer isn't actually, I wouldn't say that it is one of the natural buffers. So doing some of these experiments with, for example, bicarbonate, which is a really common
Yeah.
natural buffer, would be better. The reason we originally did these experiments is because heaps and MES buffers are what is used in the biological experiments, where you're culturing bacteria and fungi, and those are forming hexagonal bernicite. And so we were wondering whether the buffers were doing anything. And this was kind of a control experiment that we did, and then we found, oh, they are, which means that what we're culturing might not be a realistic representation of what we find in nature. Does that answer your question?
Well, there was a component piece to it, and that is heaps buffer benign
Benign to
in the environment?
in the environment?
Because if we're having to add this to our system,
Right.
do we care?
I wouldn't recommend adding heaps buffer. I would recommend looking at bicarbonate.
Bicarbonate,
Yeah.
which, that's just crushed limestone.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think that's a better way to go. And realistically, in these systems, I would say that it might be the bicarbonate that's controlling the alkalinity that might be actually affecting what kind of bernicite phase we get. Yes.
In these systems where you have like these or toxic metals like in these ponds, is there any danger of them leaching into the groundwater at all?
Yeah, so a lot of times they'll line the bottom with a liner.